This is why you should always check under your bed for monsters. In 2012, a young woman who was on the phone with her boyfriend walks downstairs to the lobby of her apartment building, collects her mail, and then heads back up to her room. She sits on her bed to start sifting through the mail when she drops her phone and it falls under the bed. She lies down on the ground to try to reach her arm out to grab her phone when she notices something horrible underneath her bed. A man is lying underneath her bed with his back to her. He's in the fetal position. She manages not to scream. She grabs her phone and says to her boyfriend, "Hey, I gotta go shower, I'll call you back." And she quickly runs into the bathroom, locks the door, turns on the shower, and then jumps out her first floor window. Once she's safely across the street, she calls the police, who quickly arrive, and they go inside and they come out with a deranged, skinny-looking man. Before they take him away, one of the officers walks over to her with a very grim look on his face. He looks at her and he just says, "We found him standing outside of your bathroom holding a knife. He was waiting for you." This is why you should never open your door for strangers. In 2013, a woman let her dog out to use the bathroom one more time before bed. After only a few minutes, she starts hearing scratching on her door, which is typically the sound her dog makes when he's ready to come in. But it just seemed way too soon for him to be done being outside. So she decides to look through the peephole to make sure it really is her dog. But what she sees is terrifying. A deranged-looking man is right outside her door, staring intently at her door handle, waiting for it to turn open. As she's looking in horror, unable to do anything, he starts scratching at the door as hard as he can, never leaving his gaze from the door handle. She manages to stifle a scream, she backs away and realizes her dog is still outside. So she goes to the side window, but there's no sign of her dog, and so she goes back to the door to see if maybe the man's moved. He hasn't moved, his mouth is open, and he's staring directly at the peephole. Then he turns around and walks away. With the man gone, she discovers her dog unharmed, his leash had just been cut. But that means he had a knife. This story is why people are scared of the dark. In the early 2010s, a man and his dog were staying at a very isolated cabin in the backcountry of Oregon. One day, he notices some human footprints leading up to and then disappearing away from his cabin, but there aren't any cabins anywhere near his, but he writes it off. That night, he wakes up to the sound of footsteps on his roof. Feeling brave, he heads to the balcony to take a look. He doesn't see anything on the roof, but his dog sees something out in the forest and he starts growling. The man starts to scan the tree line and then he sees it. A freakishly tall man is squatting on a branch just 20 feet away from his balcony. His arms are outstretched, his mouth is open, no expression on his face. The man, in terror, backs into his house, grabs his dog, shuts the door, shines the light on the branch, but it's gone. Now feeling freaked out, he shuts all the blinds, makes sure all the doors are locked, he gets in his bed, and for the next several hours, he hears tapping on both of the two doors from his friend outside. This is why you should always lock your doors. A junior in high school was home alone working on a paper while his parents were out to dinner. All night, he sits with his back to his door, sitting at his desk with his noise-canceling headphones on. Around 11 o'clock, he takes his headphones off at the same time his parents are returning to the house, and he hears his mom from downstairs yell, "Hey Adrian, what happened?" Confused, he runs downstairs and sees right away what she's looking at, muddy footprints all over the rug. He tells her, "I didn't leave my desk." And then they realize someone must have broken in. They look at the footprints and there's none leaving the house. They're worried someone's still in the house, so they run into the garage, terrified, call the police. Police arrive and they don't find anyone in the house, but they do make a chilling discovery upstairs. The police bring them to the kid's bedroom door, which had been left open all night, and they point to the message written on it in Sharpie. This is the actual transcript of what was written on his door, which means for nearly 2 hours, someone stood in this kid's doorway watching him. This story has the best ending ever. In 2003, a 9-year-old was home alone playing video games when he thinks he hears his cat meowing on the back patio, so he goes downstairs to let him in. He sees a deranged-looking man standing on his back patio howling at the sky, who then quickly looks at the boy. He grabs a fistful of cigarette butts from the ashtray, stuffs them in his mouth before he starts howling at the sky some more. After the police take the man away, they come back to talk to the boy and his family. Turns out the man had severe autism and lived in that boy's house up until his mother passed away, at which time he was transitioned to a mental institution. He broke out of that mental institution to go looking for his mom, which is how he came back to the boy's house. 15 years later, that same boy is sitting on his same back patio when he starts to hear that same meowing sound, and he looks up and it's the same autistic man walking towards his house. Knowing the man's story, he invites him into his house. The man's face lights up, he runs inside and starts crying. He was finally home. The men become friends, and every week Tom goes home to visit. This is why you should always lock your crawl space. In 2019, a young woman had just moved into the second floor of an apartment building. She noticed a tiny crawl space that connected all the apartments on the floor, but she wrote it off, citing, "Who'd be small enough to crawl through that?" One night, she walks into her living room, and out on the fire escape is a tiny woman desperately trying to yank open her locked windows. Terrified, she hides behind some furniture until the woman eventually leaves, at which point she runs into a room, grabs her phone, and calls the police. While waiting for the cops to arrive, she hears something above her and she looks up. One of the ceiling tiles had popped up, and the woman from the fire escape is staring down at her. She'd used the crawl space to get up there. The girl screams and the woman scurries away. It took 3 days for the police to finally get the woman out of the crawl space and bring her into custody. Turns out she was on some unknown, extremely hard drug and had totally lost her mind. This girl literally lived a nightmare. A 17-year-old girl was watching TV late at night when her motion detector lights in her driveway suddenly went on. She assumed it was just an animal, so she got up, drew the blinds, and went back to watching TV. Then a little bit later, it happened again. Before she could even react, she looks over and clearly makes out a silhouette of a person right behind the blinds who starts banging aggressively on the window. The girl stands up and goes, "I'm gonna call the cops!" And the figure stops for just a second, sprints to the side door and starts pounding even louder on that, screaming incoherently. The girl runs to the bathroom, barricades herself inside while she waits for the police, and then her worst nightmares come true. She hears glass shatter in the other room. After a few minutes of silence, she opens her door just a crack to get a peek outside, and standing in her living room next to a broken window is some crazy old woman who looks over at her and starts sprinting toward her. The lady comes smashing into the door and starts wailing on it until the police arrive and take her away. She was a lunatic who had escaped her facility. If you're alone right now, don't watch this video. In the winter of 2018, a man who was living alone in the mountains wakes up to find a red ball sitting on his front yard. He assumed the only neighbor he had must have kids, and so he kicks the ball over the fence, goes inside, doesn't think anything of it. That night, he wakes up to the sound of kids laughing outside of his window. He goes outside to check on them because it's the middle of the night, and there's no kids anywhere, but that red ball is back on his property. So he picks it up, brings it in his house, and goes back to bed. The next morning, he goes over to his neighbor's house to let them know that their kids were out in his yard in the middle of the night. But it turns out his neighbor is just some old man who lives alone, and there aren't any kids anywhere in the area. That night, he wakes up again to the sound of kids on his property, and when he looks outside, there's no kids, but that red ball is back on his property. Panicked, he runs downstairs to make sure the one he brought in is still inside, and it's gone. He checked every window and door, and everything was still locked. It didn't make any sense. He decides to look out the window one more time, and off in the distance is some weird, stiff figure watching him. The more you think about how this true story ends, the creepier it gets. In 2015, a college student was renting the basement apartment of his friend's house. One weekend, his basement roommates take off for the night, so he decides to use that time to get some homework done distraction-free. But as soon as he sits down to do his work, his friend upstairs and his family starts making all this noise, moving furniture around, shuffling feet. It's impossible to focus, so he picks up his phone and he texts his friend. "You guys sound like you're really having a good time up there. I'm not really getting anything done. Can I come up?" And his buddy says, "No one is home. We went to Wisconsin for the weekend." Terrified, he runs out the side door to get a look in the window to see who's making all the noise. All the lights are off in the house. There's not a single car in the driveway. He had been home alone the whole time. Sometimes monsters are real. After his parents fell asleep at night, a 9-year-old would sneak downstairs into the kitchen and crush junk food. One night, as he's making his way downstairs, he swears he can hear someone in the kitchen, but his whole family's upstairs asleep. He peeks his head around the corner, and in the kitchen is this skinny man drinking milk straight from the carton with his back turned. The boy's terrified, sprints upstairs, tells his parents, who come right downstairs, they can't find anything. It looks like no one's been in the kitchen. And they ultimately blame their son, and they say, "Your imagination's just playing tricks on you." The kid knows what he saw, and for the next few days, he felt like everywhere he went in the house, he was being watched. Then one night, he's laying in bed looking at the vent on his ceiling, and he sees a pair of eyes looking down at him. Freaks out, runs to his parents, who come in, look everywhere, find nothing, and blame him again. A couple of weeks go by, and the boy starts to notice a terrible smell coming out of the vent on his ceiling. He convinces his parents to come in and actually cut into the ceiling and go look around, and they find that skinny man, and he's dead. This is why you should be very careful who you talk to online. A 16-year-old girl was home with her mom when she got a disturbing text message from a boy she had recently met on Snapchat. He told her he was right outside of her house, but when she went to look, no one was there. Frightened, she decides to sleep in her mom's room that night, and right before she goes to bed, she gets another text from the boy that just says, "I'm in your house." She shows her mom, who immediately searches the whole house, checks every door, turns on every light. There's no one there. So even though they're creeped out, they go back to bed. The next morning, she gets up and she goes back to her bedroom and immediately feels like she's being watched. She checks in her closet, looks behind her door, there's no one there. Then she noticed that the shoe boxes she normally kept perfectly arranged next to her bed had been moved. So she crouches down to put them back in order, and then out of the corner of her eye, she notices something. The boy who was texting her was under her bed. Remember, your Amazon Alexa is always listening. In 2018, a girl named Alexa came home to her apartment to find her creepy stalker landlord in her kitchen. She screams and threatens to call the cops, and he just smiles and says, "I was just checking in on you," and leaves. Feeling totally sketched out, she spends the next few hours down the hall in her friend's apartment before finally going back to her room to go to bed. That night, she woke up to her Amazon Alexa responding to someone in the room. It said, "I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Did you say I'm watching you?" The girl instantly turns on her lights and looks around, but no one's there. So she unplugs Alexa and is about to go back to sleep when she hears what sounds like a man grunting in her closet. As she's staring at her closet, her Alexa turns back on. Be careful what you put in your body. In 2014, a couple returned to their home to find it trashed in baffling ways. There was lotion all over the door handles, all of their shoes had had their soles ripped off of them, and someone had dumped an entire can of paint all over the toilet. Despite the obvious break-in, the police come and can't find any evidence of theft, so they leave thinking the couple's not in danger anymore. That night, the couple hears scratching underneath their bed and what sounds like a crying animal. Not wanting to find out what it was, they leave and call the cops, who come right back and start investigating the house, and they make a startling discovery in their bedroom. Wedged underneath the couple's bed was this 90-pound tiny little woman carrying a huge butcher's knife and a hypodermic needle. As they're taking this crazy lady away in handcuffs, one of the officers comes over to the couple and is like, "So she was high on meth, and for at least 2 hours, she had been burrowing a hole in the underside of your mattress with that knife to get to you." Let this be a reminder that there really are monsters out there. In 2007, a woman living right near a prison in California got home late one night and went right to bed. Around midnight, she woke up to footsteps on her first floor, assumed it was her roommate, so she goes downstairs to say hi. She yells out to her roommate, who doesn't say anything, and then in walks this giant man who she doesn't recognize. She runs upstairs, jumps in her closet into the crawl space, and hides. As she's helplessly tucked away in this little crawl space, trying not to make any sound, all she hears is this giant man sprinting around her house, running into walls, flipping furniture, and screaming in frustration because he can't find her. Finally, after several hours, she slowly opens the crawl space back up, crawls out, and gets her phone off the nightstand and calls police. As she's telling the police her story, she describes the person who had broken in, and they stop her and say, "Ma'am, go back in the crawl space and stay there. We'll be there as soon as we can." It turned out a 6'11" convicted murderer had escaped the prison and was still on the loose. This is why you should never talk to strangers. In the early 2000s, a young girl was waiting outside her friend's house peeling the bark off of a tree when a strange man approaches her. As he got closer, she could see that he was grinning ear to ear and his face was white as a ghost. He walks right up to her and pinches her on the arm and says, "How would you like it if I peeled your skin off?" Just then, her friend's mom yells for her to come inside, and the man walks away. It would be years before the girl's mother would finally tell her who this man really was. Her friend's mom had seen the man pinch her on the arm and had immediately called the police, who quickly rounded this guy up. Plastered all across the inside of his van were dozens of pictures of this girl. But what they found in his storage locker is straight out of a nightmare. In the locker was a chair with hand and arm restraints. Next to it was an anatomy book and hundreds of torture tools. This is why you should never live next to crazy people. In 2015, a girl who was totally fed up with her noisy neighbors finally worked up the courage to go over there and tell them to be quiet. She knocks on the door and out walks this insane looking old woman who just starts hissing at her. And she doesn't stop hissing at her until the girl finally just leaves. She considers calling the police, but ultimately just goes back to her room and goes to bed. But she wakes up a couple hours later when she hears that same hissing sound. Her first thought is there's no way this can be my neighbor because she had her door locked. But then she notices there's a big lump right next to her in her bed and she reaches over to check who it is. Her crazy neighbor leaps out of bed and runs into the closet. This is why you should always trust your gut. In the 1970s, a young couple decided to go for a late night hike in the woods. A couple minutes into their walk, and the man remembers thinking something's not right. He tells his girlfriend, but they just decide to ignore it and keep going, until he steps on something that felt really soft, like it was alive. Before he has a chance to see what he stepped on, they hear all this rustling in the bushes next to them, and they bolt. Years later, that couple turns on the TV, and a death row inmate who's about to be executed is being interviewed. And they ask him, was there ever a time that you were almost caught red-handed? He responded, yes, one time. I was in the woods, and a couple walked through, and the man actually stepped on the body of a girl I had just killed. I was hiding in the bushes just a few feet away. They didn't see me. That couple had run into one of the worst serial killers of all time, Ted Bundy. This is why parents should believe their kids. In 2010, a 15-year-old boy started to notice that the door to his attic, which was in his bedroom, was always open. One day, when his mom's giving him a hard time about being lazy, he's like, well, you're one to talk. You always leave my attic door open. She's like, I haven't touched your attic door in months, and nobody else has either. Not easily frightened, the boy decides to leave the attic door open. And so he's laying in bed, and he kind of looks over at the door, and standing in the door frame is a figure staring right at him. He bolts, tells his parents, they don't believe him, and then 6 months later they move anyway. A few years later, the boy discovers his favorite teacher actually moved into his old house. And so he jokingly asks her, you ever see any ghosts walking around your attic? Her face got completely serious, and she's like, you know, as soon as we moved in, the door to the attic kept opening. So we investigated, and we found a trap door that led onto the roof. Someone had been crawling in through that entrance and living in the attic for years. This is why you should always be afraid of Australia. In 2014, an 8-year-old and her family went on an extended vacation to, you guessed it, Australia. After a couple of days, she started having this horrible recurring nightmare where an alien would appear in her room and try to grab her with its tentacle. After a week of this, she is terrified to go to sleep, but her parents keep telling her that it's just her overactive imagination. One night, she swears she feels that thing grab her leg and she leaps from the bed screaming. Her family runs into the room and they see her hysterical in the corner, and then they look at the bed and they all gasp. It wasn't an alien. It was a 7-foot-long adult carpet python that had been sneaking in through the ceiling tile and into her bed to stay warm every night. This is why you should always watch videos to the end. In 2003, a woman came home to her apartment to see that her door was unlocked. She went inside, nothing was missing, so she assumed she must have left it open. When it happened a few more times, but still nothing was missing in her apartment, she went out and got a camera, set it up in her apartment aimed at the front door. The next day, her door was unlocked, so she reviewed the footage. She watches in horror as late in the night, her front door opens and in walks this tall, creepy man who looks around and then walks towards her bedroom off camera. She immediately sprints out of her apartment and calls the police, who show up and tell her to go back in her apartment and just try to stay calm, and that they would put an officer right outside her door so she's safe. As she's sitting on the bed, totally traumatized, she realizes something. She only saw him enter her apartment on that video. She doesn't know if he actually left. As she's sitting there, she feels breathing on her ankles. She runs out, the cop comes in, and he finds the tall, creepy man under the bed holding a knife and a camera. This is why you should never go camping alone. In 2014, a man decided to make the multi-day hike out to a cabin in the woods where his friends were staying for the weekend. As the sun began to set on the first day of his journey, he found a clearing in the woods, set up his tent, and crawled inside. As he lay there, he started to hear what sounded like something moving around the edge of the clearing. At first, he didn't think much of it until he noticed that whatever it was circling the clearing over and over and over again. Right as he's starting to feel really uneasy, the noise just stops, and he eventually falls asleep. But But a couple hours later, he wakes up to the sound of the zipper on his tent slowly opening. Before he has time to react, the head of a man who has no eyes in his eye sockets comes inside his tent and just says, "I never asked for much," before pulling his head out and walking away. Turns out the hiker had just encountered Raymond Robinson, aka the Green Man, who was the focus of an urban legend about a faceless man that stalked people in the woods in Pennsylvania. Well, turned out it was true. This is why you should never watch my videos before going to bed. In 1986, a young girl opens her closet to find a man wearing a dress and holding an axe. He grabs her and ties her up, and then walks around the house and does the same thing to the rest of her family. While the guy is ransacking their house, one of the kids breaks free, runs next door, and tells his neighbor. The neighbor calls the cops show up, the family's saved, but the guy is nowhere to be found. The family leaves the house and stays with relatives in hopes that they'll catch this guy before they have to go back. But after a few weeks, they haven't caught him, there aren't any leads, and they say, you know what, we'll go back to our house anyways. As the family's pulling back into their driveway, the father looks up at one of the windows and sees, for a split second, the head of the man with the dress in their bedroom. They call the police, who go in and find pennies glued to the ceiling and weird writing all over the house, but they can't find this crazy guy. Until one of the officers found a secret crawl space in the basement, where psychotic killer Danny LaPlante had been living for 2 months.